So I said that I would talk about the precepts, which has been an interesting journey for me. I think partly from early work with Bernie, where he and Jishu, his wife at the time, and I, but it was really initiated by him, tried to make a Zen version of the 12 steps of AA. And we called it How to Raise an Ox, stealing Francis Cook's title of his book. And I think the idea was to really to acknowledge I don't have control over my ego. That's the first step and on the way down. And I when I look back on it, I think that was a natural thing for Bernie, which was our learning how to acknowledge and befriend was the word that we used, all those parts of ourselves that we didn't particularly like. And of course, his work, I think, with the peacemakers and, earlier, all the work with the homeless and so on, so-called engaged Buddhism was really about those parts of the social world that were sort of excluded and not allowed. So, this sort of led to the precept study for me. And then he decided to make his 3 lay teachers preceptors, which was, I think, the first time that had been done. So I think doing the Jukai ceremony in the past few years has profoundly affected me and really taught me a great deal about the precepts. And Bernie said once, there are precepts without Buddhism, but there's no Buddhism without precepts. So I think, as some of you probably know, I was professionally a philosophy professor, so I, have a history of thinking about these things. And the thing about precepts is that we tend to think of them as something over there that I should follow or adhere to or observe, or there are all kinds of words we have for this. So it's as if there's some separation between me and some sort of admonition about how we should be, how we should behave, how we should not behave. The precepts that come down to us through Dogen aren't said as don't or not stealing, not killing, not lying, etc. It's non-stealing, non-lying, etc. So the question is, why? What is that? And in many ways, I think in many places, and certainly it was true for me, the precepts are taught as there's the absolute in the ordinary sense of the word absolute. Never, ever, ever steal, never kill, never lie. And then there's the relative, depending on some situation. And then there's the absolute with the capital A. And, that was sort of it. So I wondered really what was all this about. So Dogen says, when we sit zazen, what precept is not observed, what merit is not actualized? And and of course, zazen, by zazen, he didn't mean just sitting on the cushion, but that state that, the practice is enlightenment that comes into our lives. So when you look at the commentary of supposedly of Bodhidharma and definitely of Dogen on the precepts. It's really about non. It's about being in that state or knowing that universe where there's no separation. And therefore, in some sense, there's no lying, there's no stealing, there's no killing. And I think what really that's about is that there's no lack. So it isn't as if I'm here and I lack something that's over there that I need, whether it be psychological or literal, physical, or whatever. And, you know, one of the marks of the enlightened is satisfaction. So one of the ways in which we developed the study of the precepts in my little group, No Traces, was on the one hand to take each precept and use our imagination to broaden it out and see, for example, all the different ways that we steal. It isn't just someone else's possession that we steal. We steal time, we steal attention, we steal, you know, when we don't turn the lights out in the interests of saving electricity. I'm stealing from other people when we throw trash on the ground or fail to pick up somebody else's trash on the ground. I'm stealing from other people. And so the first thing we do in this particular way of studying the precepts is to use our imaginations to discover all of the different ways that, in this case, just stick with stealing, that we actually steal. What else do we steal? We might steal time. You know, all my procrastinations adding up, that's a lot of time that some have stolen. So it doesn't really matter. It's each one of us may have some particular, you know, it may occur to me, oh, I steal something else, you know, that nobody else has thought of. So that's not the issue. The issue is really to take the sort of narrow standard sense of stealing or killing or lying or whatever, and expand it in a way to discover what is really, for me, the best way to work with this precept. What is the way that is the most striking to me about my own stealing, such that I can work with it? So that's the first thing that we do. And then the second part of the study has been to really acknowledge the killer, the liar, the stealer in me. You know, normally, I mean, at least in the beginning or in a particular way of treating any kind of moral, ethical admonition is, it's something I should never do. I may have a temptation to lie or steal or whatever, and to speak ill of others, to gossip, to blame, to be angry. And, you know, I push it away. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. It's a really bad thing. So I use my effort to do that. And of course, what happens is I've narrowed down my way of being. I mean, I've narrowed down, I've excluded parts of myself. So I think one interesting question is how is it that including everything, in particular, all those things about myself that I don't like or that I think I should not tolerate or not do or not think or not feel, what happens when I exclude those? Well, it narrows me down, and it acts as a barrier to my openness to other human beings and to the universe in general. So it's been a very interesting process to get to know oneself. It turns out to be very liberating to allow with compassion. And of course, I think compassion is actually intrinsic to allowing. It's not that there's compassionate allowing and other kinds of allowing. That when I really allow these parts of myself that I know should not be, so I think, or that I myself don't like, or that are too painful for me to deal with, there's something, I'm expanding myself. I'm relaxing into myself. I'm allowing all parts of myself. And something can happen to, let's take anger as an example. It's the easiest one because I think of all the precepts, it's, you know, in a sense, an emotion. If I'm able to take the angry, let's say I have an identity of being an angry person, or I know I get angry a lot. And I know it's not a good thing. And I know I should control it or whatever, however one wants to think of it. But what's interesting about anger is that I get rid of it by acting it out or by stuffing it. And I never get to know it. So when I allow my own anger and I get curious about it, what's it like? Not so much what triggers it, but what is it actually like? And what's interesting about emotions is that they all have a preposition, jealous of, angry at, etc. So being angry always has an object. I'm angry at you, or I'm angry at the government, or I'm angry at something. And then there's a reason you broke my vase, you know. What happens when I start paying attention to the anger itself and not to the trigger of it or the object of it, is that I get to know it. I can get very close to it. I can actually feel it. And then a sort of tantric thing happens. It's able to transform itself. So, you know, in Tibetan Buddhism, where much attention is paid to the Buddha families, you know, the 5 flags, the 5 different colors, or in the tankas, the 5 corners in the center, 4 corners in the center, and so on. And anger is associated, the anger that is the poison becomes the medicine of clarity. And what's interesting is we say in English, and I think keep saying this, I've never looked into all these other Buddha family sort of emotions, but I'm sure it's something like it is true. In our language, we say sharp tongue and sharp mind. And in the sharpness, you can see there's an energy that's the same energy, but it's sort of trapped in the anger sense, and it's sort of liberated into something else in the medicine sense. So I think each one of these precepts brings about something like that. You know, so how about lying? That's, you know, I've found in my fellow students working on all of these precepts, that lying somehow stands out as one that has made the biggest difference. So we lie all the time. I mean, it's difficult to talk about lying in this particular social, cultural, governmental, political world we live in right now and have lived in for the past 4 or 5 years. But forget about all that for a minute and just think about lying as we used to think of it, that we lie to ourselves. I mean, there's something called self-deception. And we lie to each other by not feeling 100% free to say what's really happening. We defend ourselves, and we certainly are defensive, but we defend ourselves in very subtle ways, and even defend ourselves from our own knowing of ourselves in very subtle ways. So what we've done with these, just to give the example of stealing, is that we've had these exercises. So for example, we have two kinds of questions, and one is we work in pairs. We do what's called a repeating question, and with no crosstalk. So two people, one person for 10 minutes asks the question over and over and over again, and the other person answers, and then it's asked again. And what's interesting is when you're answering like that, you start becoming, it sort of takes you off the rails of your typical answer, and you can actually discover something. So in the case of stealing, we did a double kind of repeating question. So there were two asked, one after the other, and it was, tell me something you steal. And the next question is, what kind of lack do you experience? Tell me something you steal. Attention, whatever. What kind of lack do you experience? And so it gets us to explore, you know, something that we might never pay attention to. But the point is, you know, within this practice of ours is we don't want to disown any parts of ourselves or any parts of the world or any parts of other people. It all has to be opened into and included. And there's no such thing as oneness. And when you think about the one body or the oneness of everything that has things outside of it, it's illogical. I mean, it includes everything. It's boundless. So all of this kind of thing is about, you know, in the case of stealing, there are the criminal versions, and then we use our imaginations to expand it in ways that are ordinary, certainly non-criminal, and think about satisfaction and lack, which applies. But there's another aspect of stealing, which is interesting, which is the notion of mine. That something is mine. And my enlightenment is mine, or I hope it will be mine someday. And this is a big one. I mean, anytime I want something to be mine, I'm stealing it. I'm stealing it from the great oneness. I'm stealing it from the great unfolding, as I like to say. So, you know, in Zazen, in this tradition of ours, one of the things we learn that's actually quite difficult is to be able to sit without a gaining idea, and to not treat sitting as a means to an end. To learn how to sit as if it were, not as if, but to discover that it is the end in itself. It is, as Dogen says, self-fulfilling. It's not propped up by anything else, and it's not headed anywhere else. It is what it is. And so what's interesting about describing our inability to do that as being filled with a gaining idea, you know, that I'm sitting as if it were an in order to, is that I'm then wanting something to be mine. You know, there's a lack here. So I'm sitting, you know, anytime we treat sitting that way, there's a lack. I'm lacking something and it's over there and I want it and I want it for me. So that's really interesting thing to think about deeply. It's a difficult thing. And then the second kind of exercise we do is 15 minutes. Each person does a monologue, and you just, for 15 minutes with no crosstalk, you just really explore out loud in the presence of someone else, you know, what doing this study, you know, we might spend a month on each precept and then do the exercise at the end of the month. What have I learned about myself? What have I learned about stealing or lying or blaming? And so it's as if that a kind of relaxation starts happening about ourselves. And I think that's absolutely necessary in order to get to the place where the precepts become natural and not an effortful observing or following or in some ways separate from, but they actually become what Dogen and Bodhidharma are talking about in those commentaries on the precepts, which is in the world of oneness, there is no stealing because there's no lack. There's no sense of lack and lying and et cetera, et cetera.